Naru 1959. A Swedish engineer sits at his desk holding a simple piece of woven fabric and a metal buckle. It looks utterly insignificant. But the design in his hands would go on to prevent over 1 million deaths and protect countless billions of lives. Instead of locking the patent to make a fortune, his company decides to give it away to the entire world. That piece of fabric was the modern 3-point seatbelt. But to understand why that signature changed history, we have to look back to a time when driving a car was practically a death sentence. The year was 1885. The location was New York City. An engineer named Edward J. Claghorn was granted the very first United States patent for a safety belt, but it was not for a car. It was designed to keep tourists from bouncing out of horse-drawn cabs. Claghorn's invention was a rudimentary lap belt, a simple leather strap with heavy hooks designed to latch onto the wooden bench of a carriage. It was uncomfortable, entirely manual, and at the speed a horse could gallop, largely unnecessary. But the concept of physically restraining a human body during transit was officially born. Long before Claghorn, the idea had floated around the fringes of aviation. Sir George Cayley, an English engineer in the mid-19th century, had devised basic harnesses to keep pilots inside their experimental gliders. These early pioneers did not know the word biomechanics. They just knew that falling out of the sky, or being thrown onto a cobblestone road, was fatal. They were solving a problem of gravity using the most basic materials available: heavy canvas, leather straps, and crude metal buckles. The engineering was purely mechanical. You had a mass, you had a sudden stop, and you needed a tensile force to keep the mass in place. The early harnesses were brutal. They restricted movement so severely that pilots could barely steer their gliders. But they kept the men alive. For decades, the seatbelt remained a novelty, a bizarre contraption for thrill seekers and aviators. Everyday people on the ground had no use for it. The horse-drawn carriage did not require a safety harness. The speeds were too low, and the stopping distance was too long. But a new machine was about to change everything, bringing a level of velocity the human body had never evolved to handle. When the first internal combustion engines were bolted to carriage frames, the physics of travel changed overnight. A horse could reach maybe 30 miles per hour for a short sprint. Early automobiles could do that consistently, and they had solid metal frames, wooden wheels, and zero suspension. A sudden pothole at 20 miles per hour could shatter a wheel and send the entire vehicle flipping. The passengers inside were completely exposed. There were no doors, no roofs, no safety glass, just open air and momentum. The human skeleton evolved to withstand impacts at running speeds, around 10 miles per hour. Anything beyond that turned the body into a fragile projectile. The seatbelt was not just a convenience. It was a biological necessity that the world did not yet know it needed. The 1920s. The American automotive empire was roaring. Henry Ford had put the world on wheels, and General Motors was turning cars into status symbols. The automobile went from a rich man's toy to a middle-class necessity in less than 2 decades. But as the engines got bigger and the top speeds climbed past 50, then 60, then 70 miles per hour, a terrifying problem emerged. The human body was not built for sudden deceleration. When a car crashed, it stopped. The people inside did not. They became projectiles, launched through windshields or crushed against steel steering columns. The automakers had solved the problem of mass production. They had perfected the assembly line, standardized rubber tires, and mass-produced combustion engines. But they completely ignored the problem of human retention. They built metal boxes capable of incredible speed, like bullets leaving a barrel. But they left the fragile cargo inside completely unprotected. Safety was not a selling point. Style was. Dashboard design, sleek fenders, and comfortable bench seats were the priorities. Bench seats, in fact, were a disaster waiting to happen. They were completely flat, with no side support. During a sudden stop or a sharp turn, an entire family could slide into the footwell or smash into the dashboard. The industry's mentality was simple and callous. If you crash, it is your fault. The car is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is going fast, and it is stopping. What happens to your body is your problem. But as the death toll on American highways began to climb into the tens of thousands every single year, a few doctors at racing tracks started looking at the carnage and realized the automakers were dead wrong. The car was the problem, and the lack of a restraint was a massacre. The meeting of worlds happened in the late 1940s. The racing world and the medical world collided. Race car drivers were dying at alarming rates. They were pushing machines to their absolute limits, and when they crashed, the results were gruesome. A group of doctors in California and Indianapolis began fitting heavy military surplus lap belts into their own cars and onto racetracks. The idea was simple. If you strap the pelvis to the seat, the driver stays in the car instead of being ejected onto the asphalt. One of these pioneers was Dr. Hunter Sheldon, a neurologist who saw traumatic brain injuries from car crashes every week. He designed a retractable lap belt and pushed the government to mandate them. Hugh DeHaven, a Cornell University aviation researcher, also stepped in. He studied how pilots survived plane crashes and realized that distributing the force of impact across a wider area of the body was the key to survival. He began applying aviation crash survival data to automobiles. He understood that the human body could withstand incredible G-forces, but only if the energy was managed correctly. By 1950, Nash Motors became the first major American automaker to offer factory-installed lap belts as an option. The public reaction was total indifference. Almost nobody ordered them. Consumers looked at the straps and felt insulted. They thought seat belts implied the car was unsafe, or worse, that the driver was incompetent. That decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. It was the beginning of a bitter war between public safety and corporate greed. The medical data was clear. Lap belts kept people from flying out of cars, which drastically reduced fatalities. But the early belts had a fatal hidden flaw that the engineers hadn't anticipated: the era of rejection. Throughout the 1950s, the lap belt became a controversial, almost villainous object. The problem was basic physics. A lap belt only restrained the lower half of the body. In a high-speed crash, the pelvis stayed pinned to the seat, but the upper torso violently jackknifed forward. Heads smashed into steering wheels. Ribs cracked. Worse still, the sudden, brutal pressure of the belt across the soft abdomen caused massive internal injuries. The force would tear the mesenteric artery, rupture the bowel, and sever the spine from the inside. Doctors began calling it the seatbelt syndrome. It was a medieval torture device disguised as a safety feature. The automakers seized on this. They launched quiet lobbying campaigns arguing that seatbelts were actually dangerous. They claimed belts would trap people in burning cars, or cause them to drown if the vehicle plunged into a river. The industry claimed the car itself could absorb the impact. That didn't last. The public agreed. A survey in the late 1950s showed that the vast majority of drivers believed seatbelts were an annoyance, an infringement on their personal freedom, or simply a useless gimmick. People felt safer holding a child in their arms than putting them in a belt. They believed they could brace themselves against the dashboard with their arms in a crash, not realizing the force of a 30-mile-per-hour impact would shatter every bone in their arms and still kill them. Car makers deliberately stoked this superstition. They marketed harder suspension and thicker chrome bumpers. They ignored the fragile bodies inside. And here is where the story gets dark. For nearly a decade, the industry knew people were dying. They had the data. They had the doctor's reports. They had the crash test dummies. And they chose to do nothing. The clock was already ticking. The turning point arrived in Sweden in 1958. Volvo hired an aviation engineer named Niels Bolin. Bolin had spent his career designing ejection seats for sub-fighter jets. He knew exactly what happens to the human body under extreme G-forces. When he looked at the cars of his day, he was horrified. The lap belt was a death trap. The alternative, a sash belt that crossed the chest diagonally, was equally flawed. In a crash, the sash belt would slide up toward the neck, sometimes decapitating the victim, or slip down to the waist, causing the same internal injuries as a lap belt. Bolin needed a system that would restrain both the upper and lower body simultaneously, distributing the force across the strongest parts of the human skeleton. the rib cage, the shoulders, and the pelvis. And it had to be operated with one hand, in 1 second, by anyone, regardless of their size. In 1959, he filed the patent for the 3-point seatbelt. The design was absolute genius. A single continuous belt of woven nylon anchored at 3 points. It formed a V-shape across the chest and lap, locking the body firmly into the seat, while spreading the kinetic energy of a crash across the skeletal frame. The genius was in the fixed buckle. It didn't move. The belt simply pulled out and clicked in. It was intuitive. Bolin spent months testing different anchor points, running simulated crashes with cadavers and live volunteers, measuring the exact distribution of force. He found that by placing the anchor point on the B-pillar, the vertical post between the front and rear doors, the belt would hold the shoulder down without choking the neck. The nylon webbing was designed to stretch slightly under extreme load, absorbing the energy of the human body colliding with the interior. It was a masterpiece of biomechanical engineering. Volvo installed it in their Amazon 120 and PV5i44 models. And here is the moment that changed the world. Volvo owned the patent. They could have licensed it to Ford, GM, and Chrysler, making billions of dollars in royalties. Instead, the company realized the design was too important. They opened the patent, giving the 3-point seatbelt away to every automaker on the planet for free. But the battle wasn't over. If you are finding this history interesting, subscribe to the channel. Here at Common Lore, we tell stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The global consequences of Volvo's decision took years to materialize. Even with a free, perfect design, the automotive industry dragged its feet. In the United States, the turning point came in 1965. A lawyer named Ralph Nader published a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was a scathing indictment of the American auto industry, specifically targeting General Motors for knowingly building dangerous cars like the Chevrolet Corvair. The public outrage was immediate. Congress held hearings. The auto lobbyists fought back, even hiring private investigators to follow and harass Nader. They lost. In 1968, the federal government mandated that all new cars in America must have seatbelts installed. But installing them was only half the battle. Getting people to wear them was another war entirely. Through the 1970s, the fatality rates remained stubbornly high because drivers simply refused to click the belt. They sat on them. They stuffed them behind the seats. Automakers tried buzzers, warning lights, and even interlock systems that prevented the car from starting unless the belt was fastened. The public revolted so violently that Congress actually repealed the interlock law. The resistance to a simple piece of fabric was deeply psychological. People felt invincible behind the wheel. They viewed the belt as an accusation of bad driving. In Australia, the state of Victoria became the first jurisdiction in the world to mandate the wearing of seatbelts in 1970. The results were so dramatic, with a massive drop in fatalities, that the rest of the world slowly followed suit. Europe adopted it piecemeal. The United States saw seatbelt usage climb from a dismal 15% in the early 1980s to over 80% by the end of the century. It was a slow, painful victory of legislation over stubbornness. The belt won, but only after millions of unnecessary deaths. Today, the seatbelt is utterly inescapable, but its modern engineering is staggering. The basic principle remains Bolin's 3-point design, but the technology inside that fabric is nothing short of extraordinary. Modern seatbelts are woven from thousands of synthetic fibers, capable of withstanding forces of up to 3,000 pounds. And that is the part that catches people by surprise. The belt isn't just a strap. It is an active safety system. Hidden inside the retractor mechanism is a pyrotechnic charge, like a tiny controlled bomb. When the car's sensors detect a sudden deceleration, this charge fires in milliseconds, instantly locking the belt tightly against your body before the crash impact even peaks. This removes the slack, preventing your chest from hitting the steering wheel. But it doesn't stop there. Engineers added a load limiter, a mechanical stitch in the fabric designed to tear away progressively. As the massive force of the crash hits your body, the belt actually gives way slightly, releasing just enough fabric to prevent your ribs from breaking under the pressure. It absorbs the energy of the crash like a shock absorber. The webbing is typically woven on massive looms, using polyester yarns that are incredibly strong, but designed to stretch under specific loads. The exact weave pattern is patented, designed to maximize friction and energy absorption. The buckle itself is a marvel of mechanical engineering, designed to release under tension, but never accidentally. Every single year, these belts save over 15,000 lives in the United States alone. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates they prevent hundreds of thousands of deaths annually. Since 1959, Bolin's free patent has saved well over 1 million lives and protected billions from catastrophic injury. It is the single most effective safety device in the history of human transportation. Think back to 1959. Niels Bolin sitting at his desk, holding that simple strap of nylon and metal. He didn't invent the wheel. He didn't discover electricity. He just found a way to keep people from flying through glass. It was ignored. It was feared. It was mocked. It was given away for free. And it saved 1 billion lives. That piece of fabric is sitting in your driveway right now. It is draped over the seat of your car, waiting like a silent guardian. Every time you click it into place, you are engaging a system that took a century of engineering, a war against corporate greed, and a historic act of corporate generosity to build. We rarely think about the things that save us until we need them. The seatbelt is the ultimate silent guardian. It asks nothing of you until the millisecond your life depends on it. The next time you get in your car, take a second to appreciate the weight of that buckle. It is not just a legal requirement. It is the culmination of a battle against human stubbornness. It is the legacy of an engineer who refused to accept that speed had to mean death. It is the quiet, unyielding force that keeps you breathing. If this story surprised you, subscribe to Common Lore and tell us in the comments which part of the seatbelt's history surprised you the most. And leave your like so more people can find this video.